Part 2. Rival Sleuth Hounds. Related by Christopher Jarvis, M.D. The half-hour that follows breakfast, when the fire has, so to speak, got into its stride, and the morning pipe throws up its clouds of incense, is, perhaps, the most agreeable in the whole day. Especially so when a sombre sky brooding over the town hints at streets pervaded by the chilly morning air, and hoots from protesting tugs upon the river tell of lingering mists, the legacy of the lately vanished night. The autumn morning was raw, the fire burned jovially. I thrust my slippered feet towards the blaze, and meditated on nothing in particular, with cat-like enjoyment. Presently, a disapproving grunt from Thorndyke attracted my attention, and I looked round lazily. He was extracting, with a pair of office shears, the readable portions of the morning paper, and had paused with a small cutting between his finger and thumb. "Bloodhounds again," said he. "We shall be hearing presently of the revival of the ordeal by fire." "And a deuced comfortable ordeal, too, on a morning like this," I said, stroking my legs ecstatically. "What is the case?" He was about to reply when a sharp rat-tat from the little brass knocker announced a disturber of our peace. Thorndyke stepped over to the door and admitted a police inspector in uniform, and I stood up and, presenting my dorsal aspect to the fire, prepared to combine bodily comfort with attention to business. "I believe I'm speaking to Dr. Thorndyke," said the officer, and as Thorndyke nodded, he went on, "My name, sir, is Fox, Inspector Fox, of the Basford Police. Perhaps you've seen the morning paper?" Thorndyke held up the cutting and, placing a chair by the fire, asked the inspector if he had breakfasted. "Thank you, sir, I have," replied Inspector Fox. "I came up to town by the late train last night, so as to be here early, and stayed at an hotel. You see from the paper that we have had to arrest one of our own men. That's rather awkward, you know, sir." "Very," agreed Thorndyke. "Yes, it's bad for the force, and bad for the public too. But we had to do it. There was no way out that we could see. Still, we should like the accused to have every chance, both for our sake and his own. So the chief constable thought he'd like to have your opinion on the case, and thought that perhaps you might be willing to act for the defence." "Let us have the particulars," said Thorndyke, taking a writing-pad from a drawer and dropping into his armchair. "Begin at the beginning," he added, "and tell us all you know." "Well," said the inspector after a preliminary cough, "to begin with the murdered man, his name is Pratt. He was a retired prison warder, and was employed as steward by General O'Gorman, who is a retired prison governor. You may have heard of him in connection with his pack of bloodhounds. Well, Pratt came down from London yesterday evening by a train arriving at Basford at 6:30. He was seen by the guard, the ticket collector, and the outside porter. The porter saw him leave the station at 6:37. General O'Gorman's house is about half a mile from the station. At 5 minutes to 7, the General and a gentleman named Hanford and the General's housekeeper, a Mrs. Parton, found Pratt lying dead in the avenue that leads up to the house. He had apparently been stabbed, for there was a lot of blood about, and a knife. A Norwegian knife was lying on the ground near the body. Mrs. Parton had thought she heard someone in the avenue calling out for help, and as Pratt was just due, she came out with a lantern. She met the General and Mr. Hanford, and all three seemed to have caught sight of the body at the same moment. Mr. Hanford cycled down to us at once with the news. We sent for a doctor, and I went back with Mr. Hanford and took a sergeant with me. We arrived at 12 minutes past 7, and then the General who had galloped his horse over the meadows each side of the avenue without having seen anybody, fetched out his bloodhounds and led them up to the knife. All 3 hounds took up the scent at once. I held the leash of one of them, and they took us across the meadows without a pause or a falter, over stiles and fences, along a lane, out into the town, and then, one after the other, they crossed the road in a bee-line to the police station, bolted in at the door, which stood open, and made straight for the desk, where a supernumerary officer named Ellis was writing. They made a rare to-do, struggling to get at him, and it was much as we could manage to hold them back. As for Ellis, he turned as pale as a ghost. "Was anyone else in the room?" asked Thorndyke. "Oh, yes. There were 2 constables and a messenger. We led the hounds up to them, but the brutes wouldn't take any notice of them. They wanted Ellis." "And what did you do?" "Why, we arrested Ellis, of course. Couldn't do anything else, especially with the General there." "What had the General to do with it?" asked Thorndyke. "He's a J.P. and a late governor of Dartmoor, and it was his hounds that had run the man down. But we must have arrested Ellis in any case. Is there anything against the accused man?" "Yes, there is. He and Pratt were on distinctly unfriendly terms. They were old comrades, for Ellis was in the Civil Guard at Portland when Pratt was warder there. He was pensioned off from the service because he got his left forefinger chopped off. But lately they had had some unpleasantness about a woman, a parlour-maid of the General's. It seems that Ellis, who is a married man, paid the girl too much attention, or Pratt thought he did, and Pratt warned Ellis off the premises. Since then they had not been on speaking terms." "And what sort of man is Ellis?" "A remarkably decent fellow he always seemed. Quiet, steady, good-natured. I should have said he wouldn't have hurt a fly. We all liked him. Better than we liked Pratt, in fact. For poor Pratt was what you'd call an old soldier. Sly, you know, sir. And a bit of a sneak." "You searched and examined Ellis, of course?" "Yes. There was nothing suspicious about him, except that he had 2 purses. But he says he picked up one of them, a small pigskin pouch, on the footpath of the Thorpe Road yesterday afternoon, and there's no reason to disbelieve him. At any rate, the purse was not Pratt's." Thorndyke made a note of this on his pad, and then asked, "There were no bloodstains or marks on his clothing?" "No, his clothing was not marked or disarranged in any way. Any cuts, scratches, or bruises on his person?" "None whatever," replied the inspector. "At what time did you arrest Ellis?" 7:30 exactly." "Have you ascertained what his movements were? Had he been near the scene of the murder?" "Yes, he had been to Thorpe and would pass the gates of the avenue on his way back, and he was later than usual in returning, though not later than he has often been before." "And now, as to the murdered man, has the body been examined?" "Yes. I had Dr. Hill's report before I left. There were no less than 7 deep knife wounds, all on the left side of the back. There was a great deal of blood on the ground, and Dr. Hills thinks Pratt must have bled to death in a minute or 2. Do the wounds correspond with the knife that was found?" "I asked the doctor that, and he said yes, though he wasn't going to swear to any particular knife. However, that point isn't of much importance. The knife was covered with blood, and it was found close to the body." "What has been done with it, by the way?" asked Thorndyke. "The sergeant who was with me picked it up and rolled it in his handkerchief to carry in his pocket. I took it from him, just as it was, and locked it in a dispatch box, handkerchief and all." "Has the knife been recognised as Ellis's property?" "No, sir, it has not." "Were there any recognisable footprints or marks of a struggle?" Thorndyke asked. The inspector grinned sheepishly. "I haven't examined the spot, of course, sir," said he, "but after the General's horse, and the bloodhounds, and the General on foot, and me, and the gardener, and the sergeant, and Mr. Hanford, had been over it twice, going and returning. Why, you see, sir—" "Exactly, said Thorndyke. "Well, Inspector, I shall be pleased to act for the defence. It seems to me that the case against Ellis is, in some respects, rather inconclusive." The inspector was frankly amazed. "It certainly hadn't struck me in that light, sir," he said. "No? Well, that is my view, and I think the best plan will be for me to come down with you and investigate matters on the spot." The inspector assented cheerfully, and when we had provided him with a newspaper, we withdrew to the laboratory to consult timetables and prepare for the expedition. "You are coming, I suppose, Jarvis?" said Thorndyke. "If I shall be of any use," I replied. "Of course you will," said he. "Two heads are better than one, and by the look of things I should say that ours will be the only ones with any sense in them. We will take the research case, of course, and we may as well have a camera with us. I see there is a train from Charing Cross in 20 minutes. For the first half-hour of the journey, Thorndyke sat in his corner, alternately conning over his notes and gazing with thoughtful eyes out of the window. I could see that the case pleased him, and was careful not to break in upon his train of thought. Presently, however, he put away his notes and began to fill his pipe with a more companionable air. And then the inspector, who had been wriggling with impatience, opened fire. "So you think, sir, that you see a way out for Ellis?" "I think there is a case for the defence," replied Thorndyke. "In fact, I call the evidence against him rather flimsy." The inspector gasped. "But the knife, sir? What about the knife?" "Well," said Thorndyke, "what about the knife? Whose knife was it? You don't know. It was covered with blood. Whose blood? You don't know. Let us assume, for the sake of argument, that it was the murderer's knife. Then the blood on it was Pratt's blood. But if it was Pratt's blood, when the hounds had smelt it, they should have led you to Pratt's body, for blood gives a very strong scent. But they did not. They ignored the body. The inference seems to be that the blood on the knife was not Pratt's blood." The inspector took off his cap and gently scratched the back of his head. "You're perfectly right, sir," he said. "I'd never thought of that. None of us had." "Then," pursued Thorndyke, "let us assume that the knife was Pratt's. If so, it would seem to have been used in self-defence. But this was a Norwegian knife, clumsy tool, not a weapon at all, which takes an appreciable time to open and requires the use of 2 free hands. Now, had Pratt both hands free? Certainly not after the attack had commenced. There were 7 wounds, all on the left side of the back, which indicates that he held the murderer locked in his arms, and that the murderer's arms were around him. Also, incidentally, that the murderer is right-handed. But still, let us assume that the knife was Pratt's. Then the blood on it was that of the murderer. Then the murderer must have been wounded. But Ellis was not wounded. Then Ellis is not the murderer. The knife doesn't help us at all." The inspector puffed out his cheeks and blew softly. "This is getting out of my depth," he said. "Still, sir, you can't get over the bloodhounds. They tell us distinctly that the knife is Ellis's knife, and I don't see any answer to that." "There is no answer because there has been no statement. The bloodhounds have told you nothing. You have drawn certain inferences from their actions, but those inferences may be totally wrong, and they are certainly not evidence." "You don't seem to have much opinion of bloodhounds," the inspector remarked. "As agents for the detection of crime," replied Thorndyke, "I regard them as useless. You cannot put a bloodhound in the witness box. You can get no intelligent statement from it. If it possesses any knowledge, it has no means of communicating it. The fact is," he continued, "that the entire system of using bloodhounds for criminal detection is based on a fallacy. In the American plantations, these animals were used with great success for tracking runaway slaves. But the slave was a known individual. All that was required was to ascertain his whereabouts. That is not the problem that is presented in the detection of a crime. The detective is not concerned in establishing the whereabouts of a known individual, but in discovering the identity of an unknown individual, and for this purpose bloodhounds are useless. They may discover such identity, but they cannot communicate their knowledge. If the criminal is unknown, they cannot identify him. If he is known, the police have no need of the bloodhound. To return to our present case, Thorndyke resumed, after a pause. We have employed certain agents, the hounds, with whom we are not en rapport, as the spiritualists would say, and we have no medium. The hound possesses a special sense, the olfactory, which in man is quite rudimentary. He thinks, so to speak, in terms of smell, and his thoughts are untranslatable to beings in whom the sense of smell is undeveloped. We have presented to the hound a knife, and he discovers in it certain odorous properties. He discovers similar or related odorous properties in a tract of land, and a human individual, Ellis. We cannot verify his discoveries or ascertain their nature. What remains? All that we can say is that there appears to exist some odorous relation between the knife and the man Ellis, but until we can ascertain the nature of that relation, we cannot estimate its evidential value or bearing. All the other evidence is the product of your imagination and that of the general. There is, at present, no case against Ellis. "He must have been pretty close to the place when the murder happened," said the inspector. "So probably were many other people," answered Thorndyke. "But had he time to wash and change? Because he would have needed it." "I suppose he would," the inspector agreed dubiously. "Undoubtedly. There were 7 wounds, which would have taken some time to inflict. Now, we can't suppose that Pratt stood passively while the other man stabbed him. Indeed, as I have said, the position of the wounds shows that he did not. There was a struggle. The 2 men were locked together. One of the murderer's hands was against Pratt's back. Probably both hands were, one clasping and the other stabbing. There must have been blood on one hand and probably on both. But you say there was no blood on Ellis, and there doesn't seem to have been time or opportunity for him to wash. "Well, it's a mysterious affair," said the inspector, "but I don't see how you're going to get over the bloodhounds." Thorndyke shrugged his shoulders impatiently. "The bloodhounds are an obsession," he said. "The whole problem really centres around the knife. The questions are, whose knife was it, and what was the connection between it and Ellis? There is a problem, Jarvis," he continued, turning to me, "that I submit for your consideration. Some of the possible solutions are exceedingly curious." As we set out from Baysford Station, Thorndyke looked at his watch and noted the time. "You will take us the way that Pratt went?" he said. "As to that," said the inspector, "he may have gone by the road or by the footpath, but there's very little difference in the distance." Turning away from Baysford, we walked along the road westward, towards the village of Thorpe, and presently passed on our right a stile at the entrance to a footpath. "That path," said the inspector, "crosses the avenue about halfway up, but we'd better keep to the road." A quarter of a mile further on, we came to a pair of rusty iron gates, one of which stood open, and entering we found ourselves in a broad drive bordered by 2 rows of trees, between the trunks of which a long stretch of pasture meadows could be seen on either hand. It was a fine avenue, and, late in the year as it was, the yellowing foliage clustered thickly overhead. When we had walked about 150 yards from the gates, the inspector halted. "This is the place," he said, and Thorndyke again noted the time. 9 minutes exactly," said he. Then Pratt arrived here about 14 minutes to 7, and his body was found at 5 minutes to 7, 9 minutes after his arrival. The murderer couldn't have been far away then. No, it was a pretty fresh scent, replied the inspector. You'd like to see the body first, I think you said, sir? Yes, and the knife, if you please. I shall have to send down to the station for that. It's locked up in the office. He entered the house and, having dispatched a messenger to the police station, came out and conducted us to the outbuilding where the corpse had been deposited. Thorndyke made a rapid examination of the wounds and the holes in the clothing, neither of which presented anything particularly suggestive. The weapon used had evidently been a thick-backed, single-edged knife similar to the one described, and the discoloration around the wounds indicated that the weapon had a definite shoulder like that of a Norwegian knife, and that it had been driven in with savage violence. "Do you find anything that throws any light on the case?" the inspector asked, when the examination was concluded. "That is impossible to say until we have seen the knife," replied Thorndyke. "But while we are waiting for it, we may as well go and look at the scene of the tragedy. These are Pratt's boots, I think." He lifted a pair of stout-laced boots from the table and turned them up to inspect the soles. "Yes, those are his boots," replied Fox, "and pretty easy they'd have been to track, if the case had been the other way about. Those Blakey's protectors are as good as a trademark." "We'll take them, at any rate," said Thorndyke. And the inspector having taken the boots from him, we went out and retraced our steps down the avenue. The place where the murder had occurred was easily identified by a large, dark stain on the gravel at one side of the drive, halfway between two trees, an ancient pollard hornbeam and an elm. Next to the elm was a pollard oak, with a squat, warty bole about 7 feet high, and 3 enormous limbs, of which one slanted halfway across the avenue, and between these two trees the ground was covered with the tracks of men and hounds superimposed upon the hoof-prints of a horse. "Where was the knife found?" Thorndyke asked. The inspector indicated a spot near the middle of the drive, almost opposite the hornbeam, and Thorndyke, picking up a large stone, laid it on the spot. Then he surveyed the scene thoughtfully, looking up and down the drive and at the trees that bordered it, and finally walked slowly to the space between the elm and the oak, scanning the ground as he went. "There is no dearth of footprints," he remarked grimly, as he looked down at the trampled earth. "No, but the question is, whose are they?" said the inspector. "Yes, that is the question," agreed Thorndyke, "and we will begin the solution by identifying those of Pratt." "I don't know how that will help us," said the inspector. "We know he was here." Thorndyke looked at him in surprise, and I must confess that the foolish remark astonished me too, accustomed as I was to the quick-witted officers from Scotland Yard. "The hue and cry procession," remarked Thorndyke, "seems to have passed out between the elm and the oak. Elsewhere the ground seems pretty clear." He walked round the elm, still looking earnestly at the ground, and presently continued. "Now, here. In the soft earth bordering the turf are the prints of a pair of smallish feet wearing pointed boots, a rather short man evidently by the size of foot and length of stride, and he doesn't seem to have belonged to the procession. But I don't see any of Pratt's. He doesn't seem to have come off the hard gravel." He continued to walk slowly towards the hornbeam with his eyes fixed on the ground. Suddenly he halted and stooped with an eager look at the earth, and as Fox and I approached, he stood up and pointed. "Pratt's footprints, faint and fragmentary, but unmistakable, and now, Inspector, you see their importance. They furnish the time factor in respect of the other footprints. Look at this one, and then look at that." He pointed from one to another of the faint impressions of the dead man's foot. "You mean that there are signs of a struggle?" said Fox. "I mean more than that," replied Thorndyke. "Here is one of Pratt's footprints, leading into the print of a small pointed foot. And there, at the edge of the gravel, is another of Pratt's nearly obliterated by the tread of a pointed foot. Obviously the first pointed footprint was made before Pratt's, and the second one after his, and the necessary inference is that the owner of the pointed foot was here at the same time as Pratt. "Then he must have been the murderer," exclaimed Fox. "Presumably," answered Thorndyke. "But let us see whither he went. You notice in the first place that the man stood close to this tree. He indicated the hornbeam, and that he went towards the elm. Let us follow him. He passes the elm, you see, and you will observe that these tracks form a regular series leading from the hornbeam, and not mixed up with the marks of the struggle. They were, therefore, probably made after the murder had been perpetrated. You will also notice that they pass along the backs of the trees, outside the avenue, that is. What does that suggest to you?" "It suggests to me," I said, when the inspector had shaken his head hopelessly, "that there was possibly someone in the same avenue when the man was stealing off." "Precisely," said Thorndyke. "The body was found not more than 9 minutes after Pratt arrived here. But the murder must have taken some time. Then the housekeeper thought she heard someone calling and came out with a lantern, and at the same time the General and Mr. Hanford came up the drive. The suggestion is that the man sneaked along outside the trees to avoid being seen. However, let us follow the tracks. They pass the elm, and they pass on behind the next tree. But wait, there is something odd here." He passed behind the great pollard oak, and looked down at the soft earth by its roots. "Here is a pair of impressions much deeper than the rest, and they are not a part of the track, since their toes point towards the tree. What do you make of that?" Without waiting for an answer, he began closely to scan the bole of the tree, and especially a large warty protuberance about 3 feet from the ground. On the bark above this was a vertical mark, as if something had scraped down the tree, and from the wart itself a dead twig had been newly broken off and lay upon the ground. Pointing to these marks, Thorndyke set his foot on the protuberance, and springing up, brought his eye above the level of the crown, whence the great boughs branched off. "Ah," he exclaimed, "here is something much more definite." With the aid of another projection, he scrambled up into the crown of the tree, and, having glanced quickly round, beckoned to us. I stepped up on the projecting lump, and, as my eyes rose above the crown, I perceived the brown, shiny impression of a hand on the edge. Climbing into the crown, I was quickly followed by the inspector, and we both stood up by Thorndyke between the 3 boughs. From where we stood, we looked on the upper side of the great limb that swept out across the avenue, and there, on its lichen-covered surface, we saw the imprints in reddish-brown of a pair of open hands. "You notice," said Thorndyke, leaning out upon the bough, "that he is a short man. I cannot conveniently place my hands so low. You also note that he has both forefingers intact, and so is certainly not Ellis." "If you mean to say, sir, that these marks were made by the murderer," said Fox, "I say it's impossible. Why, that would mean that he was here looking down at us when we were searching for him with the hounds. The presence of the hounds proves that this man could not have been the murderer." "On the contrary," said Thorndyke, "the presence of this man with bloody hands confirms the other evidence, which all indicates that the hounds were never on the murderer's trail at all. Come now, Inspector, I put it to you. Here is a murdered man. The murderer has almost certainly blood upon his hands, and here is a man with bloody hands, lurking in a tree within a few feet of the corpse, and within a few minutes of its discovery, as is shown by the footprints. What are the reasonable probabilities?" "But you are forgetting the bloodhound, sir, and the murderer's knife," urged the inspector. "Tut, tut, man," exclaimed Thorndyke. "Those bloodhounds are a positive obsession. But I see a sergeant coming up the drive, with the knife, I hope. Perhaps that will solve the riddle for us." The sergeant, who carried a small dispatch box, halted opposite the tree in some surprise while we descended. When he came forward with a military salute and handed the box to the inspector, who forthwith unlocked it and, opening the lid, displayed an object wrapped in a pocket handkerchief. "There is the knife, sir," said he, "just as I received it. The handkerchief is the sergeant's." Thorndyke unrolled the handkerchief and took from it a large-sized Norwegian knife, which he looked at critically and then handed to me. While I was inspecting the blade, he shook out the handkerchief and, having looked it over on both sides, turned to the sergeant. "At what time did you pick up this knife?" he asked. "About 7:15, sir, directly after the hounds had started. I was careful to pick it up by the ring, and I wrapped it in the handkerchief at once." 7:15, said Thorndyke. "Less than half an hour after the murder. That is very singular. Do you observe the state of this handkerchief?" "There is not a mark on it." "Not a trace of any bloodstain, which proves that when the knife was picked up, the blood on it was already dry. But things dry slowly, if they dry at all, in the saturated air of an autumn evening. The appearances seem to suggest that the blood on the knife was dry when it was thrown down. By the way, Sergeant, what do you scent your handkerchief with?" "Scent, sir?" exclaimed the astonished officer in indignant accents. "Me? Scent my handkerchief? No, sir, certainly not. Never used scent in my life, sir." Thorndyke held out the handkerchief, and the sergeant sniffed at it incredulously. "It certainly does seem to smell of scent," he admitted. "But it must be the knife." The same idea having occurred to me, I applied the handle of the knife to my nose and instantly detected the sickly sweet odour of musk. "The question is," said the inspector, when the two articles had been tested by us all, "was it the knife that scented the handkerchief, or the handkerchief that scented the knife?" "You heard what the sergeant said," replied Thorndyke. "There was no scent on the handkerchief when the knife was wrapped in it. Do you know, Inspector, this scent seems to me to offer a very curious suggestion. Consider the facts of the case. The distinct trail leading straight to Ellis, who is, nevertheless, found to be without a scratch or a spot of blood. The inconsistencies in the case that I pointed out in the train, and now this knife apparently dropped with dried blood on it and scented with musk. To me it suggests a carefully planned, coolly premeditated crime. The murderer knew about the General's bloodhounds, and made use of them as a blind. He planted this knife, smeared with blood and tainted with musk, to furnish a scent. No doubt some object, also scented with musk, would be drawn over the ground to give the trail. It's only a suggestion, of course, but it is worth considering." "But, sir," the inspector objected eagerly, "if the murderer had handled the knife, it would have scented him too." "Exactly. So, as we are assuming that the man is not a fool, we may assume that he did not handle it. He will have left it here in readiness, hidden in some place whence he could knock it down, say, with a stick, without touching it." "Perhaps in this very tree, sir," suggested the sergeant, pointing to the oak. "No," said Thorndyke. "He would hardly have hidden in the tree where the knife had been. The hounds might have scented the place, instead of following the trail at once. The most likely hiding place for the knife is the one nearest that spot where it was found." He walked over to the stone that marked the spot, and, looking round, continued, "You see, that hornbeam is much the nearest, and its flat crown would be very convenient for the purpose, easily reached even by a short man, as he appears to be. Let us see if there are any traces of it. Perhaps you will give me a back-up, Sergeant, as we haven't a ladder." The sergeant assented, with a faint grin, and, stooping beside the tree in an attitude suggesting the game of leap-frog, placed his hands firmly on his knees. Grasping a stout branch, Thorndyke swung himself up on the sergeant's broad back, whence he looked down into the crown of the tree. Then, parting the branches, he stepped onto the ledge and disappeared into the central hollow. When he reappeared, he held in his hands two very singular objects, a pair of iron crucible tongs and an artist's brush-case of black japanned tin. The former article he handed down to me, but the brush case he held carefully by its wire handle as he dropped to the ground. "The significance of these things is, I think, obvious," he said. "The tongs were used to handle the knife with, and the case to carry it in, so that it should not scent his clothes or bag. It was very carefully planned." "If that is so," said the inspector, "the inside of the case ought to smell of musk." "No doubt," said Thorndyke, "but before we open it, there is a rather important matter to be attended to. Will you give me the Vitogen powder, Jarvis?" I opened the canvas-covered research case and took from it an object like a diminutive pepper-caster, an iodoform dredger, in fact, and handed it to him. Grasping the brush case by its wire handle, he sprinkled the pale yellow powder from the dredger freely all round the pull-off lid, tapping the top with his knuckles to make the fine particles spread. Then he blew off the superfluous powder, and the two police officers gave a simultaneous gasp of joy. For now, on the black background, there stood out plainly a number of fingerprints, so clear and distinct that the ridge pattern could be made out with perfect ease. "These will probably be his right hand," said Thorndyke. "Now for the left." He treated the body of the case in the same way, and, when he had blown off the powder, the entire surface was spotted with yellow, oval impressions. "Now, Jarvis," said he, "you will put on a glove and pull off the lid. We can test the inside." There was no difficulty in getting the lid off, for the shoulder of the case had been smeared with Vaseline, apparently to produce an airtight joint, and, as it separated with a hollow sound, a faint musky odour exhaled from its interior. "The remainder of the inquiry," said Thorndyke, when I had pushed the lid on again, "will be best conducted at the police station, where also we can photograph these fingerprints." "The shortest way will be across the meadows," said Fox, "the way the hounds went." By this route we accordingly travelled, Thorndyke carrying the brush case tenderly by its handle. "I don't quite see where Ellis comes in this job," said the inspector as we walked along. "If the fellow had a grudge against Pratt, they weren't chums." "I think I do," said Thorndyke. "You say that both men were prison officers at Portland at the same time. Now, doesn't it seem likely that this is the work of some old convict who had been identified, and perhaps blackmailed, by Pratt and possibly by Ellis too? That is where the value of the fingerprints comes in. If he is an old lag, his prints will be at Scotland Yard. Otherwise they are not of much value as a clue." "That's true, sir," said the inspector. "I suppose you want to see Ellis?" "I want to see that purse that you spoke of first," replied Thorndyke. "That is probably the other end of the clue." As soon as we arrived at the station, the inspector unlocked a safe and brought out a parcel. "These are Ellis's things," said he, as he unfastened it, "and that is the purse." He handed Thorndyke a small pigskin pouch, which my colleague opened, and, having smelt the inside, passed to me. The odour of musk was plainly perceptible, especially in the small compartment at the back. "It has probably tainted the other contents of the parcel," said Thorndyke, sniffing at each article in turn. "But my sense of smell is not keen enough to detect any scent. They all seem odourless to me, whereas the purse smells quite distinctly. Shall we have Ellis in now?" The sergeant took a key from a locked drawer and departed for the cells, whence he presently reappeared, accompanied by the prisoner, a stout, burly man, in the last stage of dejection. "Come, cheer up, Ellis," said the inspector. "Here's Dr. Thorndyke come down to help us, and he wants to ask you one or two questions." Ellis looked piteously at Thorndyke and exclaimed, "I know nothing whatever about this affair, sir. I swear to God I don't." "I never supposed you did," said Thorndyke. "But there are one or two things that I want you to tell me. To begin with, that purse. Where did you find it?" "On the Thorpe Road, sir." It was lying in the middle of the footway. Had anyone else passed the spot lately? Did you meet or pass anyone? Yes, sir, I met a labourer about a minute before I saw the purse. I can't imagine why he didn't see it. Probably because it wasn't there, said Thorndyke. Is there a hedge there? Yes, sir, a hedge on a low bank. Ha! Well, now, tell me, is there anyone about here whom you knew when you and Pratt were together at Portland? Any old lag, to put it bluntly, whom you and Pratt have been putting the screw on? No, sir, I swear there isn't. But I wouldn't answer for Pratt. He had a rare memory for faces. Thorndyke reflected. Were there any escapes from Portland in your time? He asked. Only one. A man named Dobbs. He made off to the sea in a sudden fog, and he was supposed to be drowned. His clothes washed up on the bill, but not his body. At any rate, he was never heard of again. Thank you, Ellis. Do you mind my taking your fingerprints? Certainly not, sir, was the almost eager reply. And the office inking pad being requisitioned, a rough set of fingerprints was produced. And when Thorndyke had compared them with those on the brush case, and found no resemblance, Ellis returned to his cell in quite buoyant spirits. Having made several photographs of the strange fingerprints, we returned to town that evening, taking the negatives with us. And while we waited for our train, Thorndyke gave a few parting injunctions to the inspector. Remember, he said, that the man must have washed his hands before he could appear in public. Search the banks of every pond, ditch, and stream in the neighbourhood for footprints like those in the avenue, and, if you find any, search the bottom of the water thoroughly, for he is quite likely to have dropped the knife into the mud. The photographs which we handed in at Scotland Yard that same night enabled the experts to identify the fingerprints as those of Francis Dobbs, an escaped convict. The two photographs, profile and full face, which were attached to his record, were sent down to Basford with a description of the man, and were, in due course, identified with a somewhat mysterious individual who passed by the name of Rufus Pembury, and who had lived in the neighbourhood as a private gentleman for some 2 years. But Rufus Pembury was not to be found either at his genteel house or elsewhere. All that was known was that, on the day after the murder, he had converted his entire personalty into bearer securities, and then vanished from mortal ken. Nor has he ever been heard of to this day. And, between ourselves, said Thorndyke when we were discussing the case some time after, he deserved to escape. It was clearly a case of blackmail, and to kill a blackmailer, when you have no other defence against him, is hardly murder. As to Ellis, he could never have been convicted, and Dobbs or Pembury must have known it. But he would have been committed to the assizes, and that would have given time for all traces to disappear. No, Dobbs was a man of courage, ingenuity, and resource. And above all, he knocked the bottom out of the great bloodhound superstition. That is the end of Part 2 of A Case of Premeditation by R. Austin Freeman, read by Greg Wagland for Magpie Audio, 2025. If you've enjoyed this, then please consider giving it a thumbs up, giving it a click, giving it a subscription to the channel, making a comment, and generally being a good egg in regard to the algorithm which we swim in nightly and daily. Yes, do the right thing. Otherwise, I wish you a good night's sleep, but it may not come. It may not come. All right. Okay, cheers. Bye.